Friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is an absolute honour for me to stand here in front of you and speak about one of my favourite and most interesting topics. So thank you for this invitation to speak today. Can I just say the job of the keynote speaker who opens the conference is rather easy. All you have to do is ask the very difficult questions that you want subsequent speakers to answer. So you can read the title of my talk and some information about me. If I can just say, I'm very conscious that the audience here is a mix of people from health backgrounds and others from various backgrounds, not health. So I do have that additional challenge of explaining the concepts and issues that I'm talking about. So I hope my health professional colleagues will bear with me, because some of it might be a little bit straightforward for them, but it hopefully will not be too difficult for other people. Examine why South Asians worldwide are so prone to developing cardiovascular disease, summarize the explanations for such diseases, and also tell you about my journey. Before I do this, I would like to tell you about ethnicity. If I can have the next slide, please. Some of this terminology that I will be using may not be familiar to you, but it's a terminology that comes from Europe, and particularly the UK, where we work with the concept of ethnicity rather than race. Ethnicity being the group that you belong to for a number of reasons, including your ancestry and your culture. So we use labels like white European, or for example, white Scottish. And for South Asian, we might use a label like Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, etc. Nearly 2 billion people in the world come from the 8 countries that comprise South Asia, and about 30 million of them live outside South Asia, many in industrialized countries such as this one or the UK. The experience of people who live outside in South Asia, in countries such as this one, is being echoed throughout South Asia in the urbanizing places, but not so much in the traditional villages. That said, many of the villages and small towns of South Asia are also taking on the characteristics of urban centers. So if I can have the next slide, I will tell you a little bit about my never-ending journey. I was in fifth year in medical school in 1977, when I was in the emergency department and a 29-year-old woman came in with a heart attack. For those of you who are not health qualified, a heart attack occurs when the artery that supplies the blood to the heart itself becomes blocked. The reasons for that I will maybe go into later. So the artery that supplies the heart, which is a very powerful muscle and needs a lot of blood, has been blocked. This is one of the most dangerous health conditions that we know about. Well, she died. There was a shockwave throughout the hospital, and the emergency department was almost at a standstill. It was so unexpected. And the only explanation we had was that she was a chief executive and people spoke about her stress. She smoked cigarettes and she was on the pill. The next turning point when I went to my conference in 1984, and I was very early in my training in public health, and Professor William Littler, a very eminent professor of cardiology, met me before the conference and said, "What do you think about heart disease in South Asians, Raj?" I will tell you my answer in the next slide. In the 1980s, it was evident that heart disease and diabetes were becoming very common, and they were afflicting many members of my own family, including parents, brothers, and sisters. So I started a quest for answers through research and scholarship, and it's not the only thing I've done in my career. I've actually done many other things, but I've kept an interest in this particular problem throughout these decades. And there's a lot of mysteries that I will share with you. Well, I will share some of them, and they keep the brain cells ticking. And I hope all of the people coming to this conference will have their brain cells ticking by the end of this presentation. And in 2017 and 18, I was privileged to be given a sabbatical by my university to study this and write a book. That's the book that emerged. In fact, the manuscript was submitted at midday on the day I retired on 31st of May 2018. And the title you already know about. If I can have the next slide. Now, I had to give a first principles answer to Professor Littler. I should really have said, I don't have a clue, Dr. Littler. But I said, South Asians should have low rates of coronary heart disease compared with Europeans because they smoke much less, particularly women, and smoking is a major risk factor for these diseases. By and large, they tend to have low blood pressure, and that's particularly true for Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, less so for Indians, whose blood pressures tend to be on a par with those of white Europeans. There's a lot of vegetarianism, and people think vegetarianism is healthy, so I thought that should be protective. And there's nothing exceptional in the other cardiovascular risk factors. At that time, it was not known that diabetes was so common in South Asians. The first major study was still to be done and published in the BMJ in 1985 by Harry Keane and colleagues, showing that type 2 diabetes was rife. And type 2 diabetes on its own will double your risk of a heart attack. If I can have the next slide. On this slide, there are data from Scotland. Scotland's notorious for heart disease. They have very high rates of heart disease in Scotland and have had so for many decades. We examined through a linked cohort study what happens to a number of ethnic groups. And I'm comparing them here with the white Scottish population, and you can see there are numbers 100 males, N for males, F for females, and 100 for females. That means we're setting the standard as 100 for the white Scottish population. Think of it as a percentage. You don't want to have a high percentage here. If you look at the Indians, for men and women, it's about 20% higher than in the white Scottish population. That's astonishing because the white Scottish population have very high rates of heart disease themselves. And if you compare it to the Pakistani, they're even higher. That asterisk means that these data are statistically robust. I think there's been many studies, certainly probably close to 100, which have shown that South Asians have got somewhere between 20 and 80% higher risk of death and incidence of coronary heart disease compared with white populations, and about 200 to 300% greater than in Chinese origin or Far Eastern populations. This was only the icing on the cake of many studies that we had done in the UK, but this is very reliable data. You can't say this is a data artifact. We'll go on to the next slide, which is possibly one of the most important studies ever published on this topic. And here it's Faruhi et al., but the driving force behind this study is Paul McKeague, who's in the University of Edinburgh now, who previously worked in London. And the study is about 2,000 people in London, Southall and Brent, where there's a high ethnic minority population. And they've been followed up over 20 years. And they've asked the question, what can explain this excess? And again, I've put the numbers in red that really matter. If you take the age-adjusted numbers here, it's a hazard ratio. Here, 1 is the standard reference population for the white European level, and above 1 is bad. We can see that in the South Asian populations here, the number is 1.64, which means they had 64% excess of coronary heart disease. And the numbers below that are the confidence intervals giving us confidence that these results are statistically robust. Now the really important thing is, can you explain this? Let's add some cardiovascular risk factors. I've already mentioned smoking, blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, insulin resistance, beta cell function, you name it. It's all been added into the statistical model, When you add everything together, the number goes up from 1.64 to 2.2. In other words, if the South Asians had the same pattern of cardiovascular risk factors as the Europeans, currently they're somewhat protected, they would have more than twice the rate of heart disease compared with white Europeans. And bearing in mind that white Europeans have a lot of heart disease. So we cannot explain it, and there's been a few studies of this kind showing that we can't explain it. I'll have the next slide. I mentioned I wanted to share with you some mysteries that will tickle your brain cells, and here are some. High levels of CHD, coronary heart disease, very surprising given similar risk factors. I've already gone over that. And also BMI, which is an indication of obesity in South Asians, tends to be comparatively low. We have a very high mortality from stroke. Bangladeshis, Pakistanis particularly, but also Indians. And yet the blood pressure in Bangladeshis is substantially lower than in comparison white European populations. And high blood pressure is the #1 risk factor for having a stroke. We have high rates of heart disease and stroke, but we have low rates of peripheral vascular disease. Peripheral vascular disease is what occurs in the legs. The arteries of the legs get narrowed. That's a real mystery. Why is this disease affecting some of the circulation and not other parts of the circulation? And here, we have very high heart disease and stroke, but other diseases which have the same risk factors, like colorectal cancer, breast cancer, they tend to be low in South Asian populations. There might be 1 or 2 studies that contradict that, but there's been dozens that show this pattern. So high rates of heart disease and diabetes, low rates of cancers and accidents. And at this point, I just want to make the point that South Asians are a vigorous group of people. We are energetic, we're able, and we look great. My colleague Naveed Sattar from Glasgow University says we look great. We look great from the outside, but when we look inside, we don't look so great. When we look at our coronary arteries, we don't look so great either. So there's a few mysteries, but there's many others. So when I wrote this book and had that sabbatical, I wanted to create a new causal approach, and I'll show you what I did in the next slide. Well, I was focusing on the explanations or hypotheses, as we call them in scientific research, in South Asians compared with white Europeans, but sometimes other populations such as the Chinese. I had discussions with 22 leading researchers and scholars across the world, including the awardees from last night, Inas and Salim Yusuf, and Alka Kanaya and Lata Palyanappan, sorry about that, are also here at this conference, and they're amongst the 22 people I discussed with. The 2 lines of inquiry, i.e. my own reading of the scientific literature, my own research, and the discussions were mutually compatible. And what I've done is develop some causal pathways, and I've used what I call my jigsaw analogy. So the next slide, please. So we want to understand the causes, the causal picture in the middle, and we have a number of potential explanations: genetic factors, environmental factors, lifestyle factors, etc., etc., etc. We have to put this jigsaw together. Next slide, please. I examined what we call hypotheses. These are high-level explanations as to what's going on. It's not just the risk factors, but why are things happening. And there's probably a dozen or so hypotheses that I've gone over at some length in my work. I'm just going to share 4 with you. The thrifty genotype hypothesis has been quite compelling for many. Got a thrifty metabolism. They metabolize the food, they extract the energy from it, and for various reasons, they store that energy as food. And that used to be very helpful in prehistoric times. It's not useful anymore because we store it as fat, and therefore that's bad for you. Then we have an adipose tissue distribution hypothesis, which was generated by myself with my colleague Alan Snyderman, which effectively says South Asians don't have the healthy fat depots which are in the legs and the buttocks. They can't store the fat there, so when they put on fat, they put it into other stores, which are abdominal and intra-abdominal, or around the neck, or around the organs where it's harmful, which is true. Fat on your legs or your buttocks is very healthy, it's probably beneficial for you, but fat elsewhere is bad. The developmental origins of chronic disease, that what happens to you in the fetus, in the womb, is very important to what happens later. And South Asians are born small, for example. They're born with a birth weight of about 3 kilograms. European populations are born with a birth weight of about 3.4 kilograms, which matters a lot to babies. And could it be that this is the basis of it? And then the high heat cooking hypothesis. I've had a view for a long time that it's something to do with the cooking. And in one cookery book for South Asian recipes, I found 100 recipes. 96 involved oil, frying everything from rice to chapatis in oil. I do believe that's very important in ways that we don't understand. So that's a hypothesis we have, it's work in progress. Next slide, please. Then looking at other top-line explanations, is it in the genes? It seems very unlikely, but we have to bear that in mind. What about the way we develop socioeconomically? Is it to do with the fact that South Asians, by and large, have been quite poor, but over the last few decades have suddenly become very well off? Could it be something to do with the rapidly changing lifestyles? The demographic transition is important because as we get healthier, we live longer, and therefore these diseases are diseases of older age groups, and maybe that's the explanation. And what about the psychosocial environment? So many people said to me, well, we're immigrants and there's a lot of stress involved with the immigrant status, and there's the stress that's causing this. Well, we have to consider it. I must say the evidence for that is pretty weak. And what about infections? And especially people who were born in India, we were exposed to a lot of infections at that time, and then we come to a country like this one, where there are far fewer infections. Could it be something to do with infections? And air pollution, people are becoming more and more interested in. So these kind of explanations have been dealt with in some detail in my book. If I can have the next slide, please. Obviously, a large part of my work has been established risk factors, which are of great importance. If I have a top-line message, the established cardiovascular risk factors are very important for South Asians. Lipoprotein A is a particularly interesting molecule. I don't have the time to tell you what it is. It's Inas's passion, and if you want to learn more about it, you can ask him. I do deal with it, and I'll give you my verdict shortly. Micronutrients like vitamin D, vitamin B12, very important for health, but probably not the explanation here. I have come across one novel idea, which I'd never come across before, which I believe deserves serious study. And that is the disease lies in the microvessels that supply the coronary arteries. The coronary arteries are very muscular. They need their own blood supply. And that blood supply is called the vasa vasorum. It's something that we learn about in medical school, and then we never come across that phrase ever again in our whole lives. You can have the next slide, please. It's a surgeon that proposed this, and it appeals to me greatly. This is a coronary artery. It's an artery, and we've just cut it across it, and we're looking inside the artery. The artery is a pipe. On the left-hand side, we have the traditional view of what happens for this disease. The blood is flowing in the inner tube, and the first lining of the artery is called the endothelium. The damage is thought to start there. When the artery gets damaged there, we get a blood clot there. That blood clot may well cause a heart attack straight away, or it might become incorporated and develop a fibrofatty substance there, atheroma. What Havrick said, look at the outside of the artery. That's where these very fine blood vessels are coming in, to the outside of the artery. And if they're damaged, then that would cause damage to to the artery from the outside, the muscle layers, and what's called the adventitia, and we might have damage from the inside too. So we have two channels of damage. I think this is an incredibly appealing hypothesis because a lot of the problems that South Asians have are, in my view, to do with microvessel damage. I do believe that diabetes is also a microvessel damage disease, but I'm not discussing diabetes today. I believe there's a damage to the microvessels that supply the islets of Langerhans, which produce the insulin, where the beta cells are. That's more for the clinicians amongst you as sharing an idea. Next slide, please. So, what's been supported in my synthesis? The recognized risk factors, which I've already mentioned, I won't do it again. Adiposity. Just because your BMI is low is no consolation. It's the amount of fat in your body. Even very slim people who are of South Asian origin have a lot of fat in their body. I have a lot of fat in my body, even although people think I'm quite slim. That's adiposity. Low muscle mass. We have about 25% less muscle than a comparable European. We have less strength. We don't take nearly enough physical activity, even although we probably need far more than Europeans. And there's some dietary components that are very important. The glycemic load, that's the glucose, the sugars in our diet. Glycemic load of our diets is very high. We have far too many calories for our needs. We have a pretty high-fat diet. Fruit and veg, we take a reasonable amount, although too much of the veg is fried before it's eaten. Now, glycemia, how does glucose damage you? What's wrong with having a high glucose? The damage occurs from glycemia, which is a glycating agent, and it damages proteins. It damages proteins, glycation damages proteins in the body, and there's a lot of proteins in the blood vessels, a lot of proteins in the very fine blood vessels, and they get damaged by glucose. I think I was still on the previous slide. So that's how glycemia does it. I'll have the next slide now, thank you. What about genetic mutations? A lot of research has been done, whether it's in African origin populations or South Asian populations. There seems to be nothing particular, nothing very impressive coming up at all. The thrifty, these are ideas not getting a lot of support in my synthesis, genetics. The thrifty genotype hypothesis not getting much. One of my own hypotheses, mitochondrial efficiency, not much support. Insulin resistance has been the dominant theory for the last 30 or 40 years, and people still trot it out as if it was a fact. It's getting very little support. It's actually been undermined by Paul McKee's own study. He was the principal proponent of this hypothesis. It's his own SABRE study done, the one I explained to you earlier, that's undermined this hypothesis altogether. Inflammation is not getting much support, neither is infection, and nor there's no greater tendency to blood clotting, thrombotic tendency, i.e. formation of clots. I'll have the next slide, please. Potentially very promising ideas. There's some specific problems with low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, and of course Ina thinks it's lipoprotein A, which I've examined. I'm not sure about it, keeping an open mind. There might be other abnormalities of that metabolism of that thing. Molecules such as advanced glycation end products are produced when we cook food at high temperatures, which we do as South Asians. Our food is cooked at around about 170 degrees centigrade, which is very high. And trans fats are also created when we cook in that way. I think that's very important to look at. These substances cause arterial stiffness, which raises the blood pressure in your great vessels in the heart. I've mentioned the two pathways to atherosclerosis, from the inside out, outside in, endothelial and vasovasorum pathways, and I've emphasized the potential effects of very fine vessel damage as the basis of South Asians' propensity to heart disease and diabetes. I've got two more slides. I can see Sonny standing up, so that must be a signal, which is very good for your health, by the way. So, the next slide, please. Putting this together, I've created a table which is in genetics. The tablecloth is the economic and social circumstances in which we live, and the pieces are the traditional risk factors. I will not reiterate again, the traditional risk factors are very important. We're looking for something different. I'm emphasizing 4, glycation of tissues, the 2 pathways to atherosclerosis, arterial tree stiffness, and the 4, rapidity of change in our lifestyles, which is occurring so fast, maybe too fast. And I'll now turn to my conclusions. This is the last slide. Studies of this kind across ethnic groups and international boundaries are terribly important. We know a great deal, but more is needed. For the practitioners, you know enough to get on with it. For the researchers, we've still got more work to do. And this causal hypothesis directs attention to the established risk factors. Never decry them. Don't say we don't know anything about heart disease in South Asians. We do. The blood pressure is very important. Smoking is very important. Explanations that are popular, particularly insulin resistance, need to be de-emphasized because they're not right. And we must be imaginatively looking for promising new ideas for new detailed research. So colleagues, I hope I have tickled your brain cells, and I thank you very much.